Well, what Fletcher was daring me to say was that we're going to meet one more time next week. I got back into the Neoplatonism again. And whenever that happens, I get so involved, and it goes so slowly because the way they think he is difficult. We're going to meet next week on Thursday again. And while we're while we're talking about the class, I have to apologize for last time. I made the mistake of trying to do too much. In fact, I made the mistake of trying to do more than my concentration would allow. And it got to be just a little too pithy and too concentrated to hold together. Now, a number of people have been asking for literature to read about this course. Unfortunately, you're not going to find it anywhere. I can recommend, I recommend the mythology and the poetry and such like that, and there are a few books on Neoplatonism, but most of this takes up where both of those leave off. Okay, now last time, this is going to be the complete opposite of last time. Last time there were almost no stories, or only one story, and all explanation. This time is going to be all stories and no philosophy, just to prove to myself that I can do it. It's going to be very light and shallow. But the stories are interesting, and they're things that you probably want to have in the background of your consciousness. One thing that I neglected to mention is that Zeus also had a superior relationship that we didn't talk about. He had a love affair with one of his dry nurses. That is the nymph, one of the Melani, the ash nymphs that came out of the blood that dripped from the testicles of Uranus at castration. The ash nymphs came out of that, and Io was one of those ash nymphs. And Zeus had a relationship with her, and from her was born Iris. This was another one, going back to that whole second session that we had on superior myths, where they set up all the conditions transcendently. Io is usually stated in a number of ways. It's the number 10. And this should have been the last of the superior relationships that we talked about, because this has to do with the Pythagorean triangle. The dot triangle that proceeds from the level of the one, the internal division, to the triune perfection, and finally to the level of material completion. So the number 10, Io, is the number of the completion of the cosmos. It is very often looked at as phi or as theta, each of which has an a mathematical meaning, and in spiritual philosophy also have a meaning, but I am not in touch with all of them. If the masculine is represented by the vertical, and the feminine is represented by the circle, and the masculine is represented by light, and the circle is represented by ineffable darkness, the ultimate mystery, the union of light. The light is Zeus with the egg results in the gradient between pure light and pure darkness being the rainbow. Iris was the rainbow goddess, and it talks about the differentiation of light that occurs between the consciousness of the known and the shadow land of the unknown, proceeding from the very high vibratory yellows down to the deep violets and blues that approach a blackness. And this is why Iris was considered one of the heavenly messengers, because it represented the taking of light and the consolidation of light into the realms of darkness or into matter. Now, much later, Inachus, who was one of the river gods, had a mortal daughter. He slept with a woman, and the daughter was also named Iris. And Jupiter or Zeus must have been a sucker for the name, because he fell in love with her. Iynx, which can, in the ancient languages, be Jinx also, was a daughter of Pan and Echo. And she wanted to have a relationship with Zeus, but she never did. Is the tape spinning? I forgot to check that. Oh yeah, we're going. She wanted to have a relationship with Zeus, and she never did. And she became jealous. She was the daughter of Pan and Echo, meaning to say that she had a lot to do with the material realms, with realms of nature and the stuff of the physical world. So in her jealousy, she cast a spell over Zeus, and Zeus fell in love with Io. This is now the human Io. And Hera became jealous, and she charged Zeus with infidelity, and the Greeks always liked liars. They loved Odysseus because he knew the right time and the right way to lie. And Zeus said, I have never touched Io. Hera didn't believe him, being his collateral opposite. And so what she did is she got mad first at Jinx and turned her into a wryneck. And a wryneck is a woodpecker with a twisted kind of neck. And then she turned Io into a pure white cow. And she said, I'm going to have to keep my eye on this kid. And so she put him under the watchful eye of 1,000-eyed Argus, or the watchful eyes of 1,000-eyed Argus. Argus was the man that used to be at the North Pole. And some people even think that the many eyes of Argus represent the stars. And Zeus, even though he was a liar, he was faithful to his lovers in a way, and he wanted to free her. And so he commanded Hermes to help him free Io. And what the two of them did is they transformed themselves into woodpeckers. And they flew to where Argos was, and then Hermes knew that even though he was great at sleight of hand and at lying and at trickery, that he couldn't pull it off with that many eyes. So what he did is he got out a flute, and he played his flute until all of the eyes fell asleep. Obviously, this is a dawn myth, when the stars go to sleep, and the stars get the heavens get iris rainbow colored. And when all of the eyes went to sleep, he crushed Argus with a boulder, and then he decapitated him, and then he freed Io. But before anything could be done, Hera appeared on the scene, and the first thing she did, she honored Argus, and she took all of his eyes, and she put them in the feathers of the tail of the peacock, and she made the peacock sacred to herself. It was her Vahan, as the Hindus would say. And then, of course, being jealous, instead of blaming Zeus for the whole business, she blamed Io. And what she did is she sent a gadfly to bother Io. And the gadfly chased Io all over the world. Literally all over the known world. First she went to Dodana, and then she went out into the sea. And ever since Io, as the cow went swimming in the sea, it has been called the Ionian Sea. Then the fly chased her north, and she went along the Danube quite far north, and then she traveled all the way around the Black Sea, and then she went to the Caucasus, where Prometheus was chained to the rock, and then she went down through Asia Minor, and she went all the way to India. She followed somewhat the same course that Dionysus followed. And at India she turned around and she took a southern route, and she came through Arabia, and then she crossed the Red Sea to Ethiopia, and then she came up from the source of the Nile, and while at the source of the Nile she watched the perpetual warfare between the pygmies and the cranes, who fought each other incessantly, and she eventually settled in Egypt, and there Zeus transformed her back into a human, and she married a human called Telegonus, and she gave birth to Zeus's child, who was called Epaphus, and Epaphus eventually became Apis, the bull god of the Egyptians. Of course, the Egyptians would tell a much different story, but we're giving the Greeks their day. Later on, she had a daughter, and the daughter was called Libya, after whom the country is named, and she founded a famous temple for the worship of Iris as Iris Demeter, and the name became fudged and became Isis. Most interesting Greek outlook on the story. We could say a whole bunch of things about the story, but that would all distract, because it's one of those things that has all kinds of rich goodies in it, but we're going to pass on all of them and just make a point or two on each of the stories, and we're going to go through about 6 or 7 stories, and we're going to have 2 poems, very short poems, and one of them so difficult I'm not even sure I can read it. I think so. It still is, the genus of woodpeckers is still Iynx or Jinx. If you look in the dictionary, you find that all the woodpeckers are of that genus. Again, with the 2 Ios, we have the double cycle. We're talking, this is to finish up the last part of the last dregs of the principle that we talked so much about last time, but really couldn't say it all because we tried to say so much. It's like trying to digest too big of a meal. And that principle is that there is, in Zeus with his relationship with inferiors, they all represent first a manifestation of something in the spirit. And in the spirit, the idea is developed and it comes to a state of creative ripeness. Then in the relationship with the inferior, the same thing is lived again on the lower phenomenal realm, and then it becomes established. All of the mythical cycles that we're going to talk about, because they are indeed cycles, they all connect together, are manifestations of the principle that we hear again and again and again, and that we should look at in everything in our consciousness. It is the Hermetic axiom, or the principle of analogy. As above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after in earth. Know this and rejoice. This is the whole idea that something has to be created in spirit first. We've been looking at this as extensively as possible to say that even our lives are acted out by the gods in story fashion, in mythical fashion, before we come to birth. That all of what happens in astronomy and astrology, in the ever-changing pattern of the stars and planets, a cross-section of that represents the formula that we choose to come to birth under. It represents a whole sector or a whole mythical outlook that we're born under, and it is our duty to take those transcendental things which are flat like the realm of the Titans, as we said last time, and give depth to them by experience. And so when we experience things here, the history of our experience becomes the food for the gods, because they do not have the depth and the same kind of consciousness that we do in the dimensionality. A second principle that we want to talk about again, and they're all going to come up again, is that all of the myths of Zeus with an inferior, remember the Neoplatonists made a very big deal about relationships of Zeus with a superior, which we said represented intent. That by relating to the higher spiritual purpose, such as when Zeus internalizes by swallowing Metis, there is a reconnection with divine intent. The second kind of relationship was with Zeus's relationship with equals in his marriages to his wives, and in this case it is a relationship with the human inferior and a transcendental superior. In this case, the principle is manifest as a distribution principle. The light of Zeus becomes variety through variegation. The iris principle is the variegation of light, where light is taken away from its pure, simple quality of truth and enlightenment and given color. And in human beings, the cosmos is given color, even if that means that there has to be a lot of shadow. And so the relationships with inferiors represent variegation and variation and diversity and variety, and all of those are attributes of the phenomenal world. It is not quite as some people would think, that the spiritual worlds are just a monotone of light and therefore boring, but there certainly isn't the kind of variety and diversity and specialization and the things that we experience in this world, even to the point of becoming specialists. Libya, the daughter of Io, was equally attractive, and she had a son by Poseidon. And the son was named Agenor. And Agenor, like Cain, went east from Egypt, and he settled in Canaan. There he married Telephassa, who is sometimes called Argiope, or Argiope, and she bore him 5 sons, all of whom you've probably heard of already, but we'll go over them anyway. There's Cadmus, who we talked about before, which was sort of like the patriarch or the Adam for the Greeks, especially the Argive Greeks. He was the eldest. The next was called Phoenix. The next was called Silex. The next was called Thasus. And the next was called Phineas. And then he had a daughter. And the daughter's name was Euro, or Europa, which is where our continent, the name of the continent, comes from. In fact, it's all about this. That's what this myth is all about. Europa was beautiful, and Zeus, while tooling around heaven, saw her and he fell in love with her. And he again commanded Hermes to help him out. And he said, yeah, Hermes was sort of a pimp for Zeus. And in this case, he had Hermes drive Agenor's cattle down to the seashore where Europa and her maidens used to go for walks in the morning along the seashore. Zeus, meanwhile, transformed himself into a marvelously beautiful snow-white bull. And the bull had jewel-like horns and tremendous dewlaps. You can learn all kinds of unusual words. Dewlaps are seen usually on Brahma bulls. They are those big folds of skin, which the ancient world seemed to think were tremendously beautiful because they worshiped a lot of flesh. And there was one black streak between the horns. And Europa had never seen this bull among the rest of her father's cattle. And she was curious, and she gradually got up her courage and came over, and she found the bull to be as gentle as a lamb. And so what she did, she had her basket full of flowers, and she was garlanding the horns of the bull, and suddenly she got the urge to climb on its shoulders and ride it. And slowly the bull walked down to the seashore, and when she least expected it, he just charged into the sea, into the Mediterranean Sea, and swam off as though he were a motorboat. And she was hanging on for all of her might to her flower basket in one hand and the right horn with the other hand. And he kept swimming, and he must have been a stupendous swimmer, because he came ashore at Crete. And because he never showed his lovers as he really was, because we know what happened when we saw that last time. If he showed his lovers as he really was, he burned them to a crisp. As we saw in that story, so he changed himself into an eagle, and he ravished her as an eagle. And she bore him 3 sons: Minos, who became the king of Crete; Rhondamanthes, which is a good old Atlantean name; and Sarpedon were the names of the 3 sons. And these 3 sons, as an honor to Zeus, eventually became the judges of Hades in the underworld. They judged the human dead. In the meantime, Agenor was very distraught at losing his baby princess, the idol of his eye, and he told his 5 sons disperse and find Europa at any cost and don't come back without her. Phoenix went due west, and he went to Carthage, and there he found the Punics, founded the Punic nation. He did that for a while until his father's death, and then he came back and he refounded the place and became the founder of the Phoenicians. Cilix went to the land of the Hipparchians, which I don't know where it is exactly, and I didn't have time to look it all up, and he founded Cilicica. Phineas went to the peninsula between the Black and Marmara seas, and he had his own adventures there, and Theseus colonized the island of Theseus. Cadmus, on the other hand, the eldest, had the most peculiar adventure. First he sailed to Rhodes, and he dedicated all sorts of things to Athena and Poseidon, and then he went on to Thrace, and he had his mother with him as he traveled, and she died in Thrace. And so he and his companions were getting rather distraught at this time, and they wanted answers. So they walked overland to the Delphic oracle. And he asked, "Where will I find my sister?" And the oracle said, "You're not going to find your sister. Just desist from your search, and what you do is you find a cow and you follow it, and wherever the cow drops from exhaustion, there you found a city." And so they sailed to Phocis, and in Phocis they met cowherds. And they had one cow that had on each flank what looked like a full moon. And they purchased the cow, and they drove it. And they drove it all the way across Boeotia, and until it collapsed. And Cadmus, this is where the city of Cadmea, which eventually became the city of Thebes, but we'll get to that in another story. This is going to be all stories tonight. Not a whole lot that's deep, but next time it'll be all heavy stuff. We'll alternate that way. And Cadmus, as soon as the cow had died, said, had collapsed in exhaustion, he says, "We've got to sacrifice it immediately, or all of our endeavors are going to come to naught." And he sent his men to get some lustral water. And there happened to be a spring of Ares nearby, and the men went to get lustral water to perform the sacrifice. And there was a serpent at the spring, and almost all of his people were lost to the serpent. One after another was dropping. And so what he did, he eventually came and crushed its head with a rock. And they got the water, and they performed the sacrifice, and no sooner was the sacrifice done than Athena appeared to them and said, or at least appeared to him, and said that he should go back and get the teeth out of the serpent, which was probably a dragon if it had a lot of teeth, and he should plow and sow the teeth into the ground. And he did that. It's amazing what these stories are, aren't they? I don't know how people can come up with these things. But at any rate, he sowed, what? I haven't heard very many imaginative drunks, to be really honest. So he sows the teeth in the ground, and immediately fierce armor-clad warriors spring up out of the ground. And they are called Spartai, which means sown men. And these are the men that are to replace his people, most of which were lost in the deal with the serpent. However, they were too many of them, and they were too contentious. He said, I can't deal with an army like this. And so what he did is he threw a stone right in the middle of them, and they all blamed each other, and they fought with each other until there were only 5 of them left. And the 5 of them immediately swore their allegiance to Cadmus, and they eventually became the Spartans. And on the other hand, after this, Cadmus had to spend 1 year of penance serving Ares as a slave, and then when that was over, the city of Thebes, which was then called Cadmea, was founded, and the whole Spartan race developed from there. All right. That's right. No, has nothing to do with the pygmies that I know. I don't know. I don't know at all. Maybe it could be that comes from rock in that part of the country. I don't know. All right. There's all kinds of information in this again, most of which we're going to pass up because it gets to be too much. This is again a vertical distribution myth. And in this case, it is a distribution myth of population. On one hand, it is dispersion in population. On one hand, Cadmus, representing something like a patriarch, from above is, or in fact all of the 5 brothers, are imposing themselves and dispersing and populating. On the other hand, the physical forms, or all of the things of the world, reach up toward their parent principles in spirit, and you have the Thonian notion, or the Autothonian notion, that the things come right out of the earth. It's sort of like before there is the touching of the hourglass, the spirit is leaning itself down toward the earth, or toward matter, or toward the unknown, or toward density from its rarity, and matter reaches up toward it, and there is an indirect creation, a creation that is sort of like doing mesmeric passes but never touching what you do. So that is the kind of thing that is taking place. It is a coming from a common point, from a patriarch. It represents a splashing out or a dispersion, a great diversity. I'd like to talk about Minos and Rhadamanthys and Sarpedon, but there is not much time. But I just want to mention that it is humans that judge the dead. And the reason for this is that only humans have the experiential objective consciousness to know. It's as much the gods or God judges by intent, and it judges according to the Spirit. But to understand what comes out of our experiences and what kind of quality that we have produced, because a lot of people, some people think that, well, it's all, the intentions are all that count. It doesn't make any difference. You don't grade a person according to how much they've accomplished. You grade them according to how hard they've worked or what their intentions were. On the other hand, some people would say, oh, that's sentimental hogwash. You've got to judge them by what they actually did and how they perfected something and how they developed it and completed it. Each of them is a different kind of judgment of the quality of things. One is divine and transcendental, and the other is human and phenomenal. both kinds of judgment are important, because really only humans can judge some things, because only humans have developed those qualities that are so good and so perfected, and they know what the material world is about. God doesn't really know that. That's why we're here, because we are the agents of God in that regard. And so the fact that the children of Zeus and Europa judge the dead is because they are more capable of doing that. Now, they each represent a different principle, because the Greeks had the whole of the phenomenal realms being triune rather than quaternary, or they switched back and forth between the two of them. And each of the sons of Europa is an archetypal representation of the essence of each of the phenomenal worlds, the mental, the emotional, and the physical, containing, so they each have that kind of consciousness, and being archetypal of that, they are the judges of that. This is the judgment of potential and how potential is developed, not actual as exists in the spirit. Now, how to say this? Judgment probably represents the highest quality that a human being can develop. I know the Bible says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." I've always taken that in a positive sense, because every time I judge, I do get judged, and it stings, but it helps. But judgment has all of the faculties of the human. Self-consciousness, reason, which is not just mental, and information gained after the fact. We as humans are experiential beings. See, humans are the opposite of Titans. Titans in general represent the lordly consciousness out of which the demiurge and the humans are born. But the Titans need us for food. You see, the type of consciousness that each of them has is different. Is it too hot in here now? Oh, okay. Okay. Because I can turn the lights on. It'll be a little bit hard to read. But the Titans have a consciousness like the consciousness of Merlin. The Titans remember the future. And the Titans constantly get younger. It is that in their remembering the future, they become more and more like infants, and their conscience becomes fresher and fresher and fresher because it is more renewed in the cycling on itself. Humans constantly get older. They become more aged and more wizened and more experiential and canny and cautious and all of those sorts of things, and they remember the past and they go forward. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, that if we don't go forward building on facts, but if we remember and live our life of memory, this is why something like retrospection is a quasi-titanic activity, where we become like the Titans and we become godlike by freeing ourselves by being in that backward stream, going always back to the cause of things rather than looking forward to new effects. The two types of consciousness meet and pass each other, And for the most part, we're always looking forward, and we're always looking forward. And it isn't until after we are dead that we let go and we unspin and release ourselves back to the cosmos and become spread out into the general cosmic unity, that we have all of these memories and live a life of memory and go back to the realm of causes. So every time that we do the exercise of retrospection, where we remember our lives backwards and go from consequence back to cause, we are making ourselves more godly, because we're living in a titanic kind of existence rather than a human-like existence, which is always so forward-going. Which reminds me of something. We never did talk a few weeks ago, or last week when we talked about Zagreus being tasted by the Titans. We never did talk about Plato's argument of why we shouldn't commit suicide, because our bodies are Dionysian, but we don't have time for that, so we're going to have to pass on it. All right. The serpent's teeth, fangs, the poison, the procreation, and the autothonian effects. What we're talking about here is there is a statement in that wonderful novel, the spiritual novel by Bulwer Lytton called Zanoni. There's a statement there that the holy elixir that gives life or perpetual life to anyone becomes a terrible poison to one who is not tempered to it. And the serpent's teeth and the focus or the turning of the energy downward in the cycle of dispersion and population into the world, it has to do with the creative energy being turned downward and outward, which we're going to talk more about later. All right. Back to stories again. I have much more explanation than I thought I was going to have. I thought this was going to be just quick and brief, a few little stories to have in the back of our consciousness. All right. Now, there are so many variants of the next story that I can't go into all of them. It's the story of Leda and the swan. Some say that Zeus was in love with Nemesis, or Adrastea, as we saw, are the same being, the two poles of the same being. And he tries to unite with her, and she tries to avoid him by always becoming a being of increasing swiftness. There's a whole metamorphosis of the different kinds of beings. Eventually Zeus, who normally appears as an eagle and in part of the chase is an eagle, eventually she becomes a wild goose because they can swim very fast, and he becomes a swan, and he mounts her in midair, and a hyacinth-colored egg is produced. And there are all kinds of variants to the story. One is that it falls to earth right in the crotch of Leda, and that she hatches it. Another is that it falls to earth in a marsh where she finds it and she keeps it in a chest until it hatches out Helen of Troy. And further east, it falls into the river Euphrates, where the fishes take it in tow, and they tow it to the shore, where the doves take over and they hatch the egg, and out of it comes the goddess of love instead of Helen of Troy. But the more common variant, again, the phenomenal variant, there's a transcendental variant and a phenomenal variant, is that Zeus falls in love with Leda, and he approaches her as a swan and unites with her, and she lays either one or two eggs. In the one-egg version, it's usually the Discori, the Gemini twins, Castor and Polydeuces, and Helen that are born out of one egg. In the two-egg variant, Castor and Polydeuces come out of one egg, and Helen and her sister Clytemnestra come out of the other. Remember, Helen was married to Agamemnon's brother Menelaus until Paris abducted her and took her back to Troy. And so therefore the house of Troy versus the house of Greece fought the Trojan War over Helen. The variant that makes the most sense to me is that there are two eggs, and Polydeuces and Helen are in one, and Castor and Clytemnestra are born out of the other egg. I'm sure you're all interested in the variants of Leda and the Swan. This myth, for as short as it is and as many variants as it is, has an enormous amount of information in it. In the first place, it is an astrological allegory. The swan is Cygnus, which swims down the Milky Way, and Zeus, as the eagle, is Lyra, which we call Lyra the harp. Again, we have we'll come back to that later on and talk the astronomical part of it. Again, we have a dual cycle. First, it is Zeus, and I don't remember who her father was, but it wasn't any close relatives. I'm trying to keep the close relatives so that we can keep the cycles together. And so then there is Zeus and Leda on the lower level. And this comes back to something we've talked about before, and we can see it in a different sense now. Even the myths themselves are subject to the same kind of transduction. That is, we have the myth of the swan, the Kalahansa, going all the way back to the Hindus, the black swan, meaning that laid the egg that was at the beginning of the cosmos, meaning to say that the dark intelligence of the ineffable surrounded within itself that which became the egg out of which the whole cosmos developed, that we spent all those many weeks when we talked about the Neoplatonistic cosmogony. And here we see it as the swan and the goose. The goose even being a wild goose and being a rather profane kind of animal, and it's brought down to the level like of a folk tale. Remember the goose that laid the golden egg? It becomes a very little moralistic story, and within that moralistic story of, basically the goose that laid the golden egg says, don't try to figure out who came first, the goose or the egg, or don't try to find the source, or don't try to cut the goose open in order to get the golden egg, or you won't get any more golden eggs. It's a very moralistic story, but it basically has somewhat the same idea. It has to do with faith in the invisible source of the cosmos of things, and what the myth of Leda and the Swan does, it shows that kind of transduction of a high spiritual principle. Then we have the polarity. Here we get a very refined polarity in Polydeuces and Castor, in that, remember the story of them? They were two fighting brothers, and they were both extremely adventurous, and one of them is immortal. Polydeuces is immortal, and Castor is mortal. That's why I thought that Castor came out of the same egg as Clytemnestra, because they were both very mortal, whereas Helen of Troy, even in Goethe's Faust, becomes some kind of a transcendental symbol of edification, a beatific kind of figure that raises one to a higher spiritual level. But they loved each other so much that when Castor dies, Polydeuces goes to Zeus and says, I want him to live instead of me. And Zeus says, I can't do that. But Zeus does relent and says that eventually I'll let you share your immortality so that one of you lives 1 year and then the other one lives the next year. And here we have the whole idea of the consciousness of first being awakened, the transcendental, unified, universal consciousness, and then coming to, it's a vertical polarity, and then being aware of all of the separative details, meaning to say that you can't have both at the same time, at least not now as a human being. You can either be awake in this world where you're looking at all of the separation and details and diversity, or you can be in the unified spiritual consciousness. And so that the two brothers, that this is, you know, I'm trying to say that all of the myths of Zeus with mortal inferiors have the same theme. They show one relationship of heaven and another relationship of earth. If you remember, Helen of Troy was innocent. All she did was love, and she was so beautiful that everyone who saw her fell in love with her and worshipped her. On the other hand, Clytemnestra murdered her husband when he came home from the war. And so Clytemnestra again represents the whole principle of division and the deathly qualities of the material world. It's almost like saying that not only is mortality a product, a consequence of being in the world of distribution, but even the struggles. It's not like the perpetual bickering between Zeus and Hera, which goes on perpetually because that's transcendental. Here there are struggles to the death, and everything that lives in the distributed phenomenal world must have that kind of competition. However, it doesn't have to be personal. In the case of Clytemnestra, it was personal. I don't think in the animal kingdom that when there is a competition to constantly improve each species, and there is a deathly quality to it, and a killing quality to it, it doesn't have that personal quality. It doesn't have the intent, like I want to get rid of you. It's a much different kind of quality. All right, so Clytemnestra and Helen each represent two kinds of illusion. The Helen representing a virginal spiritual kind of illusion of let this moment live forever, all if I could only be in heaven all the time, and Clytemnestra being very unfaithful. I will try to read a poem that I cannot crack for its full meaning. I get a few of the meanings. I'm not even certain I can read it. It's so difficult. It's by William Butler Yeats, and it's called Leda and the Swan, and it's very difficult. Look. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? How can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof in tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak let her drop? Interesting. Very interesting. Yeats is hard. All right. I got shivers from that. Oh. We'll go back to Thebes now. Zeus also fell in love with Antiope, the daughter of Nyctus the Theban, and he slept with her, and they had twins, Antheon and Zethus. Amphion being something like Polydeuces, and Zethus being a little bit more slow in material. In order to have a father for her children, she married King Sicyon shortly after the conception, and this started a clan war in which her father Nyctus was killed, and her uncle Lycus avenged him and overcame the Cilicians, and he took in Antiope, who had, when her twins were born, she exposed them in a thicket on Mount Kithaeron, and they just were left to fend for themselves. And she went to live with her uncle, and her aunt Dirce treated her terribly, treated her miserably, and finally she fled. And she fled to the woods on Mount Kithaeron, and she runs into these two boys who she doesn't know are her sons, and they don't know that she's her mom. And they were cowherds on the side of the hill, and she appeals to them for aid because Dirce is chasing after her, and they mistook her for a runaway slave, and they refused to help. And Dirce came along and in a bacchic frenzy hauled her back home again. And the other cowherd says, uh-oh, you're in trouble now because the Furies are going to get you. And they said, why are the Furies going to get us? Just because we refuse to protect the slave, which is somebody else's property, is the way the Greeks thought. And they said, no, that was not a slave. That was your mother. And so they ran and they caught up with Dirce, and they tied her to the horns of a bull, which quickly dashed her to death. Bacchus, who had given Dirce the frenzy or the fury, became jealous, and he drove Antiope mad, and she ran raging all over Greece for many years until Phocas, the grandson of Sisyphus, cured her from her madness and married her. The twins went on to take over Thebes, and they built the lower city of Thebes, which until this time had been called Cadmea, as we know. And before, as they were just beginning to take over Thebes, Amphion spent all of his time playing a lyre that was given to him by Hermes. And Zethus, who was more worldly, complained that he was wasting too much time. And, don't spend all your time with that music. But later, when they started to build the walls, Amphion could play the lyre, and he could move the stones, and they just fit into place perfectly, very quickly. They were all done by the sounds of his lyre, and Zethus had to be a grunt about putting up his part of the wall, and it was slow, hard, bitter work. Zethus eventually married Thebe, and eventually the city became called Thebes instead of Cadmea. Zethus was also the original founder of Zetheism. Yes, I've been waiting for weeks to do that. Antiope, on the other hand, married Niobe. And Niobe was a daughter of Tantalus. Remember the famous Tantalus that was punished in the lake so that he couldn't bend down and drink, and he couldn't reach up for fruit. And Tantalus, Niobe was the granddaughter of Zeus and Omphale. We won't go into those. I've got side trips there, but I'm going to pass on them. And Niobe bore 7 sons and 7 daughters to Amphion. though some say she had 20 of each. It varies according to what kind of cycle you're talking about. But the father of the sons was not Amphion, but it was Zeus. So not only was Zeus the lover of Antiope, but he was also the lover of Niobe. Because they had a divine father, the children were beautiful. And she knew it. And she bragged that her children were as beautiful as Apollo and Artemis. And this was the fault of the Greeks. They liked to brag and they became proud of their accomplishments. That's the personal thing again. It's all right to judge and see that something is beautiful that you've done, but if you do it personally and become proud, that's what gets you into trouble. And Leto, the Titan, who bore Apollo and Artemis to Zeus, got wind of it and she became jealous and she called Artemis and Apollo to her and she said, kill the children. And they took their bows and Apollo killed all the boys and Artemis killed all the girls and Niobe wept endlessly. Zeus took Leto's part, and the Thebans wanted to bury the beautiful children, and Zeus turned them all into statues, and he turned Niobe into a weeping statue. Now, Thomas More, who was a poet that had two things in life that he hated. He hated doctors because he thought sort of like, what was his name? George Bernard Shaw. He thought that doctors were horrible butchers. But being a poet, he also hated bad poetry. And in his time, there was a doctor that was famous for writing terrible doggerel poetry. And so Thomas More wrote the following poem, which Bulfinch has immortalized in his mythology. 'Twas from his carriage the sublime Sir Richard Blackmore used to rhyme. And if the wits don't do him wrong, 'twixt death and epics passed his time. Like Phoebus in his car at ease, now warbling forth a lofty song, now murdering young Niobes. All right. This is again the same principle. In this case, as in many cases, it follows the generation, the grandfather, grandchild. Remember, Polydeuces and Castor alternated years. And the generations are like that. There are reversals in generations because you always rebel against your parents, so that there is more sympathy between grandparents and grandchildren than between parents and children because of the cycle of rebellion and having to repolarize that takes place between generations. And so it is that the principle of condensation works with the grandchildren. In this case, the grandchild being Niobe, the granddaughter of Antiope. It is again the principle of polarization and of condensation. I'm just going to go very quick now because we are running close to time. There's something similar here to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Probably they are Atlantis-like stories. The whole idea of indulgence. Indulgence is the great cosmic hardener. In the phenomenal world, there is already the principle of condensation and consolidation. But when we personalize it by reveling in it and indulging in it, we carry the hardness further than it should be. So the story, the Atlantean story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it wasn't so much the activities as the indulgences. Not that I'm saying that Sodom is correct or anything like that by any means, but it is the whole principle of indulging that hardens people and turns them into statues. Obviously, pain is the thing that softens us up and takes us away from the hardening effect. How far are we going here? Goodness, we've already done 4 out of 7 pages. All right, I'm going to tell a few more stories. And they're all along the same type of principle. And I want to show you just so you get the each one of these cycles gives a little bit different insight into the principle of the relationship of Zeus with an inferior. 2 of them we have talked about before. If you remember the story of Acrisius, who asked the oracle, because he had a daughter named Dani, he asked the oracle how I can have a male heir to be king after I am gone. And the oracle told him, you will have no sons, but you will have a grandson that will kill you. And then he locked, hearing this, he took it as true, and he locked Dani in the tower that just had an opening on the top in which food was lowered and excrement removed and such like that. And while she was in the tower, Zeus fell in love with her because she was beautiful, and he came on her as a mist of golden light and conceived the son. And Acrisius would not believe that Zeus was the father. He thought somebody else had done it, but he was afraid of the whole business, so he took Dani, the pregnant Dani, and she put him in an ark, a wooden cask, and put him out to sea. And eventually the son grew up to be the great hero Perseus that we talked about a couple years ago. Then several generations later, in the house of Perseus, a direct descendant was born to Amphitryon and Alcmene. The child was conceived when Amphitryon was coming back from war, and the day before he got back, Zeus appeared to Alcmene as in the image of Amphitryon, and had a tryst with her, and the fruit of that union was Heracles. In the past, we've noted the whole idea of a descent through patriarch, or a general population and dispersion. In this case, we see that not only is there a general descent and dispersion going all over, like Europa being chased by the gadfly, but we see that there is also a direct descent. That is to say that in the process, or at the heart of the process of relationships with an inferior, at the heart of that is the principle for redemption or for apotheosis. And that is to say that in the favorite or in the core principle of that creation is the seed of a redeemer as the hero. And that is what we're trying to, that's what is trying to be shown in the cycle of first Perseus If we remember, Perseus accomplished everything by imagination and such like that, whereas the later generation, Heracles, did everything by brute force. He was a very crude man, and it shows that even the concept of a hero is first presented in a more spiritual light, but it has to come all the way down to the needs of humans, and so that later on you find a rather brutal kind of hero. So there is a hierarchical kinds of, a step-down kind of principle that takes place in the relationship with inferiors. Sort of like the generations represent that the principle is brought down level by level by level. It's interesting to note here that there is an east-west trend in all of these myths, that the dispersion and the condensation and the placing of the epitome always travels from the east to the west. That the west represents a progress, and it's sort of like a follow the direction of the sun. But when you follow that so far, you have the turnaround where you come back. All right, now we have one last little story, and we'll try to tie everything together a little bit and finish with this theme. And then next time we're going to talk exclusively on the theology of Plato, and we're going to talk about the sensible worlds in the same way that we spent 5 weeks talking about the supersensible worlds. We're going to try and do it in 1 week next week. The notes are almost done, and it is only a 1 week's work. And Paul doesn't believe it, but it is. Callisto was the daughter of Lycaon. She was a follower and a companion of Artemis, which meant a strict life of celibacy. Zeus slyly seduced her one day, probably in the woods where Artemis spent all of her time. And a short while later, Artemis noticed that Callisto was getting a little heavy. And Artemis was insulted that one of her followers should not maintain the vow of purity, and she changed Callisto into a bear. And she sent the dog pack after them, and the dog pack certainly would have caught the bear and ripped it to shreds, because they had done that. Remember Actaeon, the young prince and hunter, was going through the woods one day, and he stumbled on this beautiful pond, and there was Artemis taking her bath. And because he saw her nude, she changed him into a stag and sicked his own dogs on him, and they caught him and ripped him to pieces. And this certainly would have happened to Callisto. And Zeus, however, was faithful to his lovers, and he rescued Callisto by taking her up into heaven, and eventually she was set into the stars as the little bear. The child of the union of Zeus and Callisto was Arcas, who was the founder of the Arcadians. This is a sidereal myth, again, and it is also a double myth, again, because Zeus at one time also attempted to seduce his daughter Artemis by becoming a bear, and she tried to avoid him by becoming a bear, and she tried to make her face ugly, again, by daubing it full of gypsum. The Greeks had this thing about gypsum. We talked about it some before. And she eventually became materialized as the big bear. So Callisto is a little bear, and Artemis is the big bear. And as the big bear, she used to rule the stars of night until Zeus eventually took over that capacity. Now, we've mentioned before that the forces of form and matter are strongest at the equator. Things go through their life cycle faster. People age faster. Animal forms, plant forms are gigantic at the equator. While new plant forms like corn and things like that are evolving away from the equator toward the poles. On the other hand, at the poles, the forces of life and of spirit are stronger, and they evolve toward the equator. So will especially, and eventually will and intelligence come from the north, and they work their way toward the equator. I don't want to get into the whole thing because it's a really long thing. And so we have here a dimensionality in the same way that there is a coming down from heaven to earth in the relationship of condensation and of distribution in Zeus's relationship with inferiors. The same thing literally happens on the surface of the earth, with the heaven being at the poles and the earth being at the equator, that there are two forces that go toward each other and they meet in the central temperate zones. Now, Arcus is one of the names for our current pole star at the tip of the little bear. The pole stars change. Arcus is also, by the way, the name of Arthur, Arcturus. Arthur is the king, and the round table is the circle of pole stars. We talked about that a few years ago. I'm getting, if this course goes on for many more years, I'm going to feel old for all of everything that has been said. Being the northmost star, the pole star represents the highest of spiritual power and of spiritual wisdom. It represents the esoteric wisdom. We've talked about that with dragons sleeping around the pole. We talked about that last time. Whereas the equator represents the worldly life or the more material life. In fact, the Chinese used to call the pole star the emperor, whereas the pole of the ecliptic, which is in the center of the circle of the pole stars, was called the grand emperor. And the changing of dynasties meant the changing of pole stars. And the loss of Artemis ruling the stars means that the pole star changed from the big bear to the little bear. It went from Artemis to the lover of Zeus. That's a perfect sidereal interpretation of it. The ubiquitous Arcadians, and you can find Arcadians everywhere, from the Cajuns in Louisiana to the Cajuns in Canada, to the Cajuns in Greece, are all associated with esoteric schools. They're associated with round temples on the top of hills. They represent that high esoteric wisdom, and everything, their architecture is always circular. So the Arcadians represent the initiates, the ones who bring down or who materialize the rare spiritual qualities to the lower latitudes. Now, in this, it's interesting to note that the swan, which is also the symbol of the initiate, is among the circle of pole stars, and it is flying due south down the Milky Way, and so does the eagle, by the way. And they're both flying down toward the ecliptic equator, all in the same sector of the heavens. Until you get right down at the equator in that sector of the heavens, you have the scorpion which crawls on its belly. The story, it has to do with the creative energy or the sexual energy being projected downward in in this sector of the heavens till it gets to where the scorpion is. And strangely enough, and in the claws of the scorpion, which are part in the constellation of Scorpio and part in the constellation of Libra, that is a constellation that is a little sub-constellation that is called the Tree of Life. So sector by sector, going from the pole going down, there are all kinds of stories. And this is the story in this sector going downwards is the story of the coming into matter in what could be called the fall of humanity from the swan, which like we had at the beginning of the year, Eurynome who danced on the water and in the air. It's like the swan. The swan can fly and it can swim, but it does terrible on earth, and nothing can, that we know of, can live in fire. And so it's that kind of principle, the swan coming down, and it eventually gets down to where there is the crawling serpent, and the serpent is trodden under the foot of Ophiuchus, who is struggling with yet another serpent or scorpion, and so the whole story is there. So if we look at this and combine this now with the story of Europe and the story of Niobe and all the other stories, we have two motions. We have the motion that goes from east to west and then it goes from south to north. The east to west motion has to do with the propagation along the horizontal, and it has to do with the filling out of the work, the completion of the work. It has to do again with the horizontal relationship wherein there is no hierarchy, and there are constant infusions coming from the north, which indicate new material is constantly being brought down to enliven that which becomes condensed as the history of the past. So we combine this all with the whole idea then, if we look at the process, the dual cycle myths have to do with as above, so below. They have to do with things taking place in spirit and then being condensed and distributed or populated and variegated in the world, and they become the history. They become experience. They become, and they also provide the path of apotheosis so that we can climb back up to the North Pole. So we've looked a little bit at the three relations now. In the love of Zeus with superiors, especially when he swallows Metis, which is the same as swallowing Phanes, it is an internalization. And when he internalized and kept Metis in his belly, he gained wisdom into the divine intent or the higher purpose. And probably he also gained humility, because anytime you look at something greater than yourself or beyond yourself, you are humbled by it. In the lovers with collaterals, we saw the horizontal relationships, and we saw the conditions that set up the possibility of precipitation and distribution, especially the relationship with Demeter that produced Persephone, which became his first love that was an inferior. The possibilities were made by filling out all that could be done on the transcendental horizontal, and when they were filled out, there was nowhere to go but downward in the vertical. So then there are the dual cycle relationships that lead to distribution, diversity, population, externalization, materialization, and the hidden self becomes externalized. See, upward, because we're all little Zeuses. And when in prayer or contemplation or adoration when we put our consciousness with a greater than ourselves, we internalize and we unify ourselves with purpose. We fulfill our activities by the various grades of equal relationships, but it is with the inferiors where we go downward, and instead of internalizing, we externalize. And there are attitudes to that, because in the interior, everything is known. In the exterior, we're interfacing with the unknown. And therefore, the wholesome attitude is an attitude of curiosity. Also, there is the attitude of responsibility. I want to quote a friend of mine, or roughly quote a friend of mine who I consider very great. His name is Al Dong. He said something to the effect that Christ in the body of Jesus associated with inferiors. And his reaction was one of grace, compassion, and faithful service and responsibility. What is our attitude toward our inferiors? The plants, the animals, food. So it's again the personalization. With the inferiors, we personalize. The attitude, as it should be graceful responsibility. The Little Prince, I'm sure all of you have read, have all of you read The Little Prince? I used to read it once a year, and if anybody wants a copy, I can get a couple of copies in and lend it out. It's probably one of the best children's stories ever written for adults. And the Little Prince says, you are responsible for what you tame. We owe a great deal to the animals, plants, and to the minerals for sustaining us and all the experience they've given to us. We are the superiors to them. We need to give them wisdom. We need to give them intent and purpose. Because we've taken a lot away from them. Like in many ways, we've taken the animals away from their natural evolution. And we just can't make them receptacles of our neuroses so that they represent our malformed intents and our twisted purposes inside of ourselves that we haven't redeemed. And we just sort of shoved in. You can neurotify an animal very quickly. You can't make them things to gratify yourself. So you can get pounds and pounds of butterfat out of a cow, but it has to wear a brassiere or such like that, or you turn chickens into cannibals and all of things like that. We can't indulge ourselves in them for our sake, that they have a purpose to live for also. And so I think there's a great deal wanting, not only in our relationship with the consciousness above us, but probably much more in the consciousness below us. And it is there that it most clearly tells what we really think, what we're really like. We can try to fake it, and we can try to be uplifted in our prayers for a few minutes, but when something is our charge and something is our responsibility, I know this sounds like a moral sermon, but I'm a moralist and I have to live with it, that there is where we really show what we are. Do we care about things and fulfill our responsibility? Do we align their existence with the divine intent? We can still be creative. We can still participate in changing things, as it is our divine destiny and duty to do so. But it is necessary that we do so in harmony with intent. All right. All that remains now in this course is to finish off what we started, and that is the table created by G.R.S. Mead in his version of the of the theology of Plato. And we're going to talk about the sensible world next time. And it'll again be the Plato will probably reincarnate just to say, no, that isn't what I meant. And it'll be very, very new and creative. Sorry for having to drag it on to one more week, but it just have to be. Questions? Zethus. See, you're the second generation. You're the one that brings it down to earth. It's down to earth.